I was going through my analytics for my blog today, and I noticed something kind of surprising that I wanted to share with you. Now, before we get started, though, I have to have a disclaimer here that this is my personal blog statistics, and they're not very impressive. You can see exactly how many people aren't reading my blog. I only get like 13 visits a day on a good day. And you know what, to be honest, that's okay. I really just keep this personal blog as sort of an outlet for my writing, and I don't do any promotion for it. And although it's embarrassing, there's something we can learn here today. And I noticed as I was going through my stats today that I actually have a huge bounce rate, 90.07%, and that really caught me off guard. Now, if we hover over it, we can see what Google defines the bounce rate as. It's the percentage of single-page visits in which the person left your site from the entrance page without interacting with anything on the page. So that's kind of interesting. A bounce really is someone who just views one page and then is gone. And I have 90.07% of the people doing that. And that was kind of surprising to me. And so if we take a look at my blog, this is codynoldon.com. You can kind of see what may influence that bounce rate and whether 90.0 whatever percent is something that is accurate. So you'll notice that on my homepage, I have a lot of text. And this is all actually my latest blog post that is displayed in full text form, all on the homepage. And so if you're coming to this site, the first thing I think when I think of bounce rate is that you could probably get all that you're looking for if you found that you haven't read this latest blog post. You may read it all, and then you may bounce off. You may leave without interacting on the page. You're just reading. And so maybe a lot of people are doing that. That may be what's causing my bounce rate to be so high. Maybe not all people are clicking through. I mean, I'd like some people at least to be clicking through to the categories or other posts, but I suspect that those people that are reading are actually being counted as a bounce when they shouldn't. And so I'm thinking that the way we could solve that is by having scroll tracking on this site, where we could fire a Google Analytics event when someone has scrolled past a certain point and when they've stayed on the site for a certain amount of time. The reason why we do that is so that we can fire an event if someone is reading the page. Google Analytics doesn't know if someone's actually reading or not, and so if we tell them, it'll be a way for us to kind of have a more manageable bounce rate. And by firing that custom event, it'll count that visitor as not a bounce. So now when I think about scroll tracking, there's several things that we have to consider. The first is that scroll tracking should always be accompanied by time tracking. The reason is because if someone comes to my site, flips all the way to the bottom and says, nope, that's not what I'm looking for, and goes back, they should be a bounce. But they scrolled the entire page. And so scrolling is important. We need to have a threshold of scrolling, but we also need to have time on page that is measuring whether or not someone's actually reading and getting something out of it. So for this page, I would say, maybe if we have someone scrolling half the page and staying on for at least 30 seconds, then we can count them as not a bounce, and we can fire a Google Analytics event. Now, the way that we do that, we need to do some coding for it, and it's going to be with JavaScript. Now, JavaScript is awesome. We can actually practice in our browser before we go to start writing it on our own. The way you can practice is if you right-click, this is in Google Chrome, and you go to Inspect Element. And here there's actually a JavaScript console. And this is kind of like an old command line you've seen in the movies where you can put code in and it'll echo out whatever response that you want. And so what I'm going to do is kind of demonstrate to you some of the functions that we're going to use to write ourselves a good scroll tracking plugin. Now, for starters, we're going to use the jQuery library. If I type jQuery and hit enter, then I can see that jQuery returns something. jQuery is something that's on most blogs, and it's something very common that we're going to make use of. Now, when I look at jQuery, though, another thing I'd like to mention is that, at least on my particular page, the $sign isn't defined as anything. The $sign is typically something that jQuery is aliased as, and so we need to make sure that in our plugin, our scroll tracking plugin, we watch out for that. So some of the common jQuery functions that we're going to use are these. jQuery body.scrollTop. What this is it tells us the current position that we've scrolled to. Now I just ran that and it says 0. Now if I scroll a little bit and I run it again, in the console if I push the up arrow, I can actually get back some of the previous commands that I've entered. So I'm going to run that again, and you can see I've scrolled to position 188. That actually means 188 pixels down the page. So if I go all the way down the page and run it again, I've scrolled 3,795 pixels. Now, if we wanted to find out how big our document actually is, what we can do is run jQuery window.height. and it says, oh no, see, that was the window.height. That's the height of the window that I'm currently on. So if I do jQuery body.height, that'll tell me the height of the page that I'm actually on. So the height of the body is actually 4,321 pixels. Now you'll notice that I scrolled to the bottom, but I only scrolled 3,795 pixels. And I kind of gave away the punchline here. The reason is because the window height actually adds into that as well. So the scroll top function actually only measures to the top point at which I've scrolled, which is this line up here. If I take the scroll top plus the height of my window, it should equal the height of the entire body. So let's try that right now. So I'm going to go down here. I can't see what I'm typing. There we go. And that's equal to the body of the height. So you can see those are equal. So we're going to make use of those a lot in our little plugin. The other thing that we can do is understand the difference between jQuery body and jQuery window. You'll notice I did not put quotes around window. The reason is because window is actually a JavaScript keyword, and it represents the window of the browser. And jQuery is programmed to understand that when you pass in a keyword like window, to use that window of the browser. Now body isn't a keyword. As you can see, it gives me an error, and that's why I need to have it in quotes, because body is actually an HTML element on the page. So that's kind of the introduction to what we're going to need to do when we're with our scroll tracker. We're going to make use of those plugins right now. And so let's go ahead and get started and start coding away some things that we want to do for our plugin. Now this is going to be quite advanced JavaScript, but as I go along, I'll try and explain everything as best as I can. So whenever you start a jQuery plugin, you actually want to do what's called a self-executing function. And what this is a way for you to ensure that the namespace you're working in is unpolluted. So what I did was I just wrote a function that I'm going to have as a parameter of $, and then I execute. As soon as I create that function, I execute it right away, passing in the jQuery object. This is a really common method in jQuery to kind of namespace your code so that it's isolated, and we know that the $, which is a common shortcut for jQuery, is actually what it says it is. It's jQuery. A lot of other JavaScript libraries like to take over the $, and so that's why we're very territorial over it. So when I'm passing it in, now I know that I want to start writing out my scroll tracking function. The way that we do this, we're going to do it as a jQuery plugin. We're actually going to go $.fn. And then we're going to name our plugin Scroll Tracker. And this is just a function that we're adding to jQuery's fn namespace. That's just a common way to do jQuery plugins. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to set up some sensible defaults. And what we're going to do is we're going to call those some thresholds. Now, if you remember, what we talked about was we wanted to set up a scrolling threshold, and we want to set up a time threshold. Now, for scrolling, to make things kind of convenient, let's declare it in the form of a percentage. So that's going to be the percentage of the page that must be scrolled. And then the time, let's define that in seconds. And that's going to be the seconds that the visitor must linger. Now, these thresholds are very good. You'll notice I set up an options kind of parameter to come into our jQuery plugin here, and let's make use of that right now. A very common thing to do is to use the jQuery extend method. And what extend does is it takes as many parameters as you want to give it, and it's usually going to be a JSON object. And what it'll do is it'll overwrite the parameters with one after another. And so if I do this, then it'll take my defaults right here of scroll of 0.25 and time, and then take the options variable, the one that I'm passing in. And if I pass in any options that have scroll or time, it will overwrite these with what I pass in as my options and store it all in the thresholds variable. It's kind of a shorthand to make sure that we can just simply refer to thresholds throughout. So really the gist of what we're going to be doing is we're going to be setting up a event to be bound to the window scroll event. So we're going to do window.onScroll, And we're going to execute a function. I guess I'll just call it measure scroll. And this function is going to be something that is going to track how far down the page we've moved. Now in this measure scroll function, I know that I'm going to have to check, and I'll just write pseudocode right here. I'm going to say if passed or exceeded distance threshold and exceeded time threshold. This isn't real code. I'm writing just pseudocode here so I can go back and fill it in later. Then I'm going to fire Google Analytics event, and I'm going to take off the measure scroll event. The reason I want to do that is so that I don't keep tracking the measure scroll after I've exceeded my distance and time thresholds. And I can actually do that right now. That's actually something we can do. So instead of window.onScroll, we're going to do offScroll, and we're going to take off the same function or method that we put on. Now the firing the Google Analytics event, I can actually write that too. We know that we're going to use the old ga.js, and we're going to track an event of window scrolled. You actually can look at the format of it. It's category, action, label, and value. So track event is the event, the category is window, scrolled is the action, and if I wanted I could put label and value if I want. I just named it window scrolled because that's something generic. We're not really caring if, we call it something special. So we're doing great. We're firing our Google Analytics event and we're taking off scrolling. The problem is this exceeded distance threshold and exceeded time threshold. So if we're going to be having thresholds, we need to know kind of how much we have. So outside of that measure scroll function, I'm going to set up some tracking variables to show how much we have. The first one is distance traveled, and I'm going to set up as 0, and seconds elapsed. What these are variables that we're going to increment or add to throughout our scrolling function, and we'll keep track of them in these here. Now, if we're going to track how much we have, we also want to track how much we need. And so I'm going to do a distance required, and I'm going to do a seconds required. Now, we know that seconds required is actually pretty easy. That's going to be thresholds.time. That's because we set up thresholds up here, and it's 15 seconds. Distance required is a little more complicated because thresholds.scroll is a percentage of the page that must be scrolled. And so I'm going to calculate here for distance required what exactly 25 or whatever percent of the page is going to be. And so I can do that by doing body.height times thresholds.scroll. Now this is going to take the height of the entire body and times it by whatever percentage the threshold of scrolling is. Now that's actually not complete. If you remember what we talked about before, the window size actually factors into it. If I scroll to the bottom, then I can only go as far as whatever the body height is minus the window height. And so to be completely accurate, what I'm going to do is have this be the body height minus window.height. That way it's just to be accurate. We can have as far as we are able to scroll times whatever the threshold percentage is, so 25% maybe in this case. So that sets up how much we need. Then we can just set up some, some initial values really. And I'll use these to keep track of how much we've progressed. Start time is the current time right now, and old position is going to be what we're going to keep track of where we were since the last scroll. That's kind of our ongoing kind of placeholder variable. And I'm going to start it off as the scroll top right now of what it is. Chances are that'll be 0 as it'll start off. And so old position starting value will be wherever we're scrolled to currently at the page. So now when I want to come in here, I can actually write out this pseudocode. So if the exceeded distance threshold, when the distance traveled is greater than the distance required, and the seconds elapsed is greater than the seconds required, then fire off my event and remove the scrolling. Now that's kind of easy to say, but we're not keeping track of any of this stuff. So the way that this works is that every time I scroll in my browser, if I do a scroll, that's going to fire an event, this scroll event, and measure scroll is going to be fired. And it's going to be happening so fast in rapid succession as I'm scrolling on the page. So every time measure scroll fires, I'm going to need to keep track of where my current position is, and I need to calculate the distance traveled and the seconds elapsed so that I can keep track of that and fire this if statement at the right time. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to, every time the measure scroll function is fired, every time they scroll on the page, I need to calculate the current position. And that's really just going to be the same thing that we set for the old position. It's going to be the scroll top. Then I'm going to calculate the seconds elapsed and I'm going to calculate the distance traveled. Seconds elapsed is actually pretty easy. It's going to be whatever the current time is minus whatever the start time was. So the current time, I'll just say is new date. Whoops, I didn't have an equal sign. And I'll put the new date in parentheses and then I'll do minus start time. Now, the way that I'm doing it though is in seconds, and JavaScript has a date function called .getTime that will actually transform a date into the number of milliseconds that have passed since 1970. It's kind of a Unix timestamp. And what that'll do is it will give us a raw number, basically the number of seconds that have passed now minus the number of seconds that had passed at our start time will give us the number of seconds that have elapsed. Now, this is actually not the number of seconds. I made a mistake there. It's actually the number of milliseconds. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this whole thing and we're going to divide it by 1,000. So that'll be the number of seconds elapsed because milliseconds have 1,000 milliseconds for every second. Now, the distance traveled is actually going to be something that we're adding on over time. So the distance traveled is something that we're going to grow as we scroll. Seconds elapsed, we can always calculate it fresh, but distance traveled is going to be incremented. So I did a plus equals right there. And I'm going to basically say current position minus the old position. Now that'll work as long as the current position is greater than the old position. It'll give us a positive number. So if they're scrolling down, the current position will be greater than the old position. But if they're scrolling up, then the old position will be greater than the current position, and this will be a negative number. Distance traveled, you could think of it like an odometer, and so what we want to do is call math.abs to make it an absolute value. And as we add it to distance traveled, whether we're going up or whether we're going down, it'll always add a positive number to distance traveled. Think of it like an odometer in a car. It always gets bigger whether you're going in reverse or whether you're going in forward, in drive. So after we've done that, we can actually take old position, or take the value of current position and assign it into old position. And that way, next time when we scroll, we'll know where we were from before. Now, really, that's it. We're done. And we can actually come and test this out. So I'm going to add a few more things so that we can actually see that this is working. There's a special function called console.log. And what that'll do is it'll take our Chrome developer tools and output messages to the console. So when I go here, I'm going to actually log to the console my seconds elapsed, and I'm going to make it nice so we can see. And I'm going to log our distance travel. Now, you will never include the console.logs in your actual production code. We're just doing this so we can actually see that things are firing. I'll add one right here. All right, so now we've got it all here. Now, this is awesome. So let's just highlight it all, and I'm copying it to my clipboard. And I'm going to come over here to my browser, and I'm actually going to go right into the console, and I'm going to paste everything that I just did and hit enter. And luck would have it, I got undefined, which means that no errors happened. So if I scroll, of course, nothing happens. Why? The reason is because we just defined the plugin as a function right here, but we're not actually executing the function. So right below, just for convenience, I'm going to actually put a document.ready, which is jQuery shorthand to say execute this function when the page is entirely loaded. And then I'm going to say jQuery.fn.scrollTracker. So when the page is ready, I'm going to execute scroll tracker. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to put it on the page right here. Now when I got that, I should start seeing scroll tracking. Look at that. It's flying. So 67, 68 pixels traveled, 3.5 seconds elapsed. As I go, it's getting bigger, 88, 89 with 10 seconds elapsed. So over 15 seconds have elapsed. Now let's see if we can scroll for more than half the page. And look at that. I scrolled for more than a quarter of the page, actually. It was about 957 pixels. And the GA event fired. And when I scroll, nothing more happens. So it looks like we did a good job. It works well and even on the first time, almost like magic, right? So I'm going to go here and I'm going to take out all of these console.logs. And then I'm going to go into my WordPress backend and I'm going to actually add this code directly to my theme. By just putting it right here in the console, that wasn't enough, obviously. You'll need to actually save it to your website. I just did that so we could see it working right away. So there you go. I'll put this up on GitHub so you can use it and make your own scroll tracker to be whatever you want. Thanks for joining, and I hope it was helpful for you.